I'd first of all like to say it's great to be meeting you here in Irvine because I do come to Irvine a lot for a New Yorker. I sit on the board of a digital health company here, and we also have some other family business here as well. So thank you for being located here of all places. It's very convenient.
My pleasure, and thanks for coming to my office.
And you've been a professor here at UC Irvine for quite some time now, right?
Since July of 1983.
July of 83. So not as far back as June of 83, but July of 83 is quite some time ago. And you're a quantitative psychologist. Could you describe briefly what that is?
It's doing psychology and psychology experiments, psychology theories, but being very mathematical about it. So trying to come up with mathematical theories about, for example, in the case of perception, how do we see in 3D? How do we see the motions of objects? How do we recognize objects? But to have a mathematically precise theory. And then also to do experiments where we're doing mathematical analyses of the data.
Now, much of your work contradicts a proposition that I think most scientifically minded people would probably agree with if they heard it. Specifically, that it's overwhelmingly advantageous to perceive reality more or less as it is from a survival and evolutionary standpoint. So if I completely fail to perceive an SUV that's barreling down the road and step in front of it, I'll have a hard time passing my genes along to future generations of pedestrians. And therefore, people might suppose that over thousands of generations, people and animals have evolved to have a fairly accurate perception of reality. Now, however intuitive that proposition may seem, you believe it's entirely wrong. And in arguing this, you quite correctly point out that at many times in scientific history, we've discovered things which seem massively intuitive turn out to be massively wrong.
Oh, yes. So we used to think the Earth is flat because anybody can just look around and see that it looks flat. There are some hills and so forth, but other than that, as far as the eye can see, it looks quite flat. And so until about the time of Pythagoras, a few hundred years BCE, everybody pretty much that thought about it thought the Earth was flat. And it took a real bright group of Greeks to figure this thing out and figure out, no, it's not flat, it's more like a sphere. And then for many centuries after that, almost 20 centuries, the very bright people believed the Earth wasn't flat, it was like a sphere, but they believed that the Earth is the center of the universe and doesn't move, and again, because it looks that way. And we see the sun and the moon and stars seeming to go around in arcs around us while we stay at the center. And so we mistook our perceptions for an insight into reality, and it even was church doctrine that the Earth is the center of the universe, and it fit in nicely with the whole worldview that they had.
And Galileo famously got into a fair amount of trouble by arguing otherwise, and other scientists as well. And it is really true. Few things seem more intuitive than the flatness of the Earth to a person standing at any point on Earth. When you argue that our intuitions could again be wrong, and our perceptions might just diverge wildly from objective reality, yet still be advantageous, you often cite a very powerful metaphor of a computer desktop.
That's right. The idea about the computer desktop is that our desktop interface hides a lot of complexity inside the computer. If you're writing an email and the icon for it is blue and rectangular in the middle of the screen, does that mean that the file itself in the computer is actually blue and rectangular in the middle of the computer? Well, of course not. Anybody who thought that just misunderstands the whole point of the desktop interface. It's not there to show you the truth of the computer. It's there to hide all the transistors and software and voltages and magnetic fields. If you had to toggle voltages to craft an email, no one would hear from you. So the interface is there not to show you the truth, but to hide the truth. But even though it hides the truth, it lets you control the truth. It lets you control reality by giving you just the reins that you need to control it without showing you what the reality is that you're controlling.
Now, when we move from the computer desktop to reality as we perceive it, we find that our senses sometimes make similarly radical simplifications of the world around us, thereby making it comprehensible. An example you use that I find quite powerful is the experience of heat.
So when you put your hand into a bathtub of water, for example, and feel the temperature of it, you just get a simple feeling from very, very cold to lukewarm to very, very hot. But what's going on, the physicists will tell us, is far more complicated, that there are trillions upon trillions of molecules that are bouncing around in all sorts of complicated ways. And all we're doing when we feel something being hot or cold is a statistical summary of something that's far more complicated. We're getting effectively one or two numbers, but there are trillions of things going on. And so we have a huge data compression.
It's a radical simplification, again, without which we simply couldn't operate in a world of heat versus cold. So that's one sensory simplification of reality that we've all experienced. And you argue it goes far beyond sensory mapping to the entire experience of space and time.
That's what evolution has done for us. Space-time, three-dimensional space as you perceive it right now is just your desktop. And physical objects like tables and chairs, the sun and the moon are just icons that are in the desktop. They're not the objective reality. They don't resemble objective reality. They're just symbols that let us interact with whatever objective reality is while we're completely ignorant about the nature of that objective reality.
So the chair that I'm sitting on in this view of reality, it has a certain look and feel. It's got a pretty good UI for me. I know where to put myself. I know how to settle myself into it in order to not collapse onto the ground. And what you would argue is this is a radical simplification of something that might be unimaginably complex or might just be unimaginably different, but it is an icon that is as useful to me as the trash folder on my computer. Now, I guess you're going to tell me that there is not actually a trash can sitting inside my computer?
That's exactly right.
So that's also a metaphor. Got it.
That's right. It's just a metaphor. So the trash can icon doesn't mean there's a real trash can inside your computer, but it is a useful icon to tell you that if you drag your email icon to the trash can icon, you'll delete that icon. That's also a warning. Or another example, if you have a paintbrush icon, but there's no paintbrush inside the computer, there is a complex program that you're utterly ignorant of, and it's doing all sorts of things to pixels that you don't want to know. And yet, by having just that simple paintbrush icon, you can do your drawing or your illustration.
And it would, needless to say, be beyond impossible for any mere mortal to do the manipulations necessary within the memory of the computer to have the impact of that paint stroke if we didn't have that iconic layer. Now, when you start applying that to physical objects that we know and love, like chairs and spoons in the sun, it starts sounding like you're taking the metaphor a little far. It sounds a little bit radical, although it's definitely uncontroversial to say that we don't perceive all of reality. For instance, I believe it's far less than 1,000% of the electromagnetic spectrum that we perceive. And other creatures that we share this planet with actually perceive other parts of the electromagnetic spectrums. Sometimes this is called the Umwelt. Would you care to talk about that a little bit?
In my language, I would say the Umwelt idea is that every creature has been shaped by natural selection to have its own user interface, depending on which niche it's going to occupy. So humans, we create a space-time desktop with certain kinds of physical objects. And as you mentioned, we have a certain range of light that we can see, electromagnetic spectrum. But birds have a broader spectrum than us. They can see in ultraviolet where we can't. Pit vipers can perceive some infrared that we can't. Some fish can perceive electrical fields in the water, and we can't. And some birds and perhaps bees can even see the polarization of sunlight. So there's all sorts of...
I didn't know they could see polarization.
Yeah, there are some, I believe, birds or bees that can see polarization as well.
Wow.
And so different creatures have different interfaces for the niches that they're occupying, and much of the competition between different species is an arms race between interfaces. For example, with mimicry and camouflage, you're trying to find the vulnerabilities in the interfaces of your predators or prey and exploit those vulnerabilities. Our interfaces evolve due to all these different selection pressures.
David Eagleman, I had interviewed a few episodes ago, gave a fascinating example. I'm sure I'm going to get the species wrong, but it's something like the stoplight lantern fish or something like that. And it's a fish that lives so deep in the ocean that red light cannot penetrate. There's no red light down there, but it phosphoresces a red light. And it has this very clever chemical trick to actually perceive that very frequency of red light. And so this particular fish, they can signal each other for mating purposes, for socialization. It's almost like they have their own encryption layer down there because their Umwelt perceives red light. So it is uncontroversial to say we don't see all of reality. It is uncontroversial to say different critters have different takes on reality. And another thing that is uncontroversial to say is that an enormous amount of reality reconstruction, or perhaps construction, occurs within the brain. And you make this point in your book about how enormous the visual cortex is, how large it is as a proportion of the brain, and why it has to be that big, all the different hacks that it's carrying out.
The standard view that we have intuitively, in the case of visual perception, we're just taking a picture of the world, just like a camera. That idea is too simple. A third of the brain's cortex is involved in vision, literally billions of neurons. I would guess 20 to 30 billion neurons and trillions of synapses spring into action every time you just open your eyes and look around the room. And that's far more computational power than you would need just to take a picture. And the standard view in my field is that all that computational power is there because they think of the brain as a reality engine. We are in real time creating all the three-dimensional shapes that we see, the colors, the motions, the objects.
Because there are profound physiological limitations to vision. For instance, it's only 1 or 2 degrees out of a field of view, which is something like 250 by 150 degrees. It's only the middle 2 degrees that we truly see in high definition, correct?
Exactly. The full field vision is all we have high resolution, which is quite counterintuitive. We feel like we see high resolution everywhere in the visual world, but we don't.
We do not. The traditional neuroscientists would say that the visual cortex is so large, partly because it's filling in high def where there's only a tiny speck of it. Tell us what saccades and fixations are, because that's quite an amazing thing that the brain has to compensate for as well.
That's right. So your eyes jump around 2 to 3 times a second, maybe up to 4 times a second. You're evaluating the whole visual field to see where something of interest might be happening. So things that are flickering, moving, high contrast, we're always looking at those things.
And not just that, but in normal everyday interactions, our eyes are constantly darting. And even just having a conversation with somebody, your eye is darting from the left side to the right side of their face, etc. We'd think it'd be almost like the Blair Witch Project, that old movie where the camera's shaking everywhere. But the brain is correcting for that. And then, of course, also the back of the retina is two-dimensional. And as you'd said earlier, we're constructing this 3D view. The traditional neuroscientists would say, because we've got this tiny, narrow bit of HD, we're constantly darting around, we're kind of got this 2D image, and we're taking all those inputs and pulling it into this big, full, vibrant, wide-angle HD image. That's what this third of the brain is doing. Who was it that said we don't see with our eyes, we see with our brains?
I don't know who said that, but it is common in the neurosciences to say effectively that it's the brain that's doing all the hard work.
While the traditional neuroscientific view is the brain is reconstructing reality, I believe you would argue with all that horsepower, there's no reason it can't be constructing reality essentially from whole cloth.
Everybody in my field, all of my colleagues, believe that we're constructing what we see, but that in the normal case, what we construct is a fairly accurate and faithful reconstruction of the true shapes and colors and motions of real objects. And I'm saying, in some sense, something less radical. I'm just saying we construct. To say we construct and that the constructions are reconstructions is a much stronger claim.
Yeah, the traditional view is that that third of the brain, which is visual, is a reality engine. You would suggest that it is a virtual reality engine.
Exactly right. We've had the helmet on all the time.
Yeah. One thing that might support this is this phenomenon called synesthesia. Could you talk a little bit about synesthetes, which are the people who experience the phenomenon of synesthesia?
About 4% of humans are synesthetes, where they have a melding of the senses that most of us don't experience. So to be concrete, one synesthete named Michael Watson, everything that he tasted on his tongue, he felt in 3D space in front of him with his hands. He could actually palpate them with his fingers in front of him. He didn't see them, but he felt these objects. So mint felt like a tall, cold, smooth column of glass. So every time he tasted mint, he could feel with his hands this cold, smooth column of glass in front of him. And every time he tasted Angostura bitters, he felt a basket of ivy. He could feel the texture of the leaves, the shape of the leaves. It was not an abstract idea. It was a concrete perceptual feeling. Here's a case where he's creating a three-dimensional object to represent something that's utterly unlike that object. Angostura bitters in no way resembles a basket of ivy, and mint in no way resembles a tall, cold column of glass. Those objects that he created in his perceptual system were merely icons. They were useful icons to do a job, but they weren't there to resemble anything.
Was his job, just out of curiosity, mixology? Was he a cocktail maker? Because both of those things sound like things that go into fancy drinks.
He wasn't a mixologist, but he was an accomplished cook because every taste had a unique three-dimensional shape. I only gave 2 examples. Every taste had a three-dimensional shape. It was a huge repertoire of objects, and so he used that to do some fantastic cooking.
Now, that is an extreme case. So when you talk about something like that and then say that's 1 out of 25 people, people might say, wait, I've certainly never met somebody like that. But in more mild cases, people will have a very strong association between different numbers and different colors, for instance, right? What are some of the more mild manifestations?
Yeah, that's one of the more common one is what they call color grapheme synesthesia. Each printed letter or printed number has a specific color. Maybe 1 is red and 2 is green and so forth. For each synesthete, that association of numbers or letters and colors is constant over their whole life. It varies from synesthete to synesthete, but it's constant over life. Another kind that's common is to have a visual experience, say of a color, to something that you hear. And one extreme case of that is a woman named Carol Steen. Everything that she hears, she actually sees not just a color, but a three-dimensional object with a specific shape and a specific color and a specific texture to it. So she has a sculpture she made, she's an artist as well, for the sound Saito. So when she hears Saito, there is a specific three-dimensional shape that she sees. You can look it up. She can see her sculpture and get a feeling for how specific and detailed the objects are that she sees for each sound that she hears. But even that specific static sculpture doesn't quite do justice, because she says, as the word is being pronounced Saito, the sculpture is changing, it's moving, it's dynamic, and so she can only capture one frame of that. So this is a very, very rich user interface that evolution is trying out, and who knows, maybe her interface will be the one that catches on later on.
As we're talking here, I'm just realizing I might have the mildest case of synesthesia myself. I hadn't really thought of it until now, but for about 12.5 U.S. states, I have overwhelmingly powerful color associations.
Wow.
I grew up in Connecticut. To me, Connecticut is yellow. Not the state. It's not like the streets and the houses and the people are yellow, but Connecticut summons yellow. Rhode Island summons green. Massachusetts summons sort of like an earth brown. Florida summons sort of like a bright orangey red. And that's as far as it goes with me. But it's interesting that that exists on a spectrum, and there are these very powerful examples. And this is not maladaptive. These people obviously have not been selected out by evolution, and it actually brings, in some cases that you've just cited, tremendous advantages in certain areas.
Absolutely. For Michael Watson, it helped him in his cooking, and he had an advantage over the rest of us in his cooking. Carol Steen, as an artist, has a real advantage. Anything that she hears creates such a volume of beautiful visual images that she has this wealth of work.
It's almost like they both have unfair advantages in these areas of expression that they've chosen. And it's interesting to contemplate. If we go back on the savannah, it would be very advantageous to not get devoured by a lion.
I would agree.
Now, imagine we end up in an evolutionary environment in which, the survival of the fittest means that you open an awesome restaurant. We've ended up in some evolutionary setting in which only great cooks have lots of kids. In such a world, the genes for experiencing these 3D shapes for different tastes and a very, very rich palette of them could be selected for over generation over generation over generation, and eventually all humans will have descended from a series of great chefs who all get to have lots and lots and lots of kids. And that would become consensus reality. Of course, mint is a cold glass column.
Absolutely. That is exactly the right logic of evolution by natural selection. That's why we have the interface that we have right now. It was the vagaries of our evolutionary past and what happened to work in the niche that we happen to be in. But you're absolutely right. In that scenario, there would be selection pressures for us to all have something like Michael Watson's synesthesia.
And instead, we have whatever the really good lion dodgers.
Exactly.
However they perceive the world, the good lion dodgers are the people who've handed down our genes. Now, you've alluded to it.